I received a will from my grandmother and it was quite scary at the time. I'll never forget the day the letter arrived. It was an ordinary Thursday, one of those days where the minutes blur together in monotony. I was sifting through the mail, bills mostly, when I saw the envelope with my name scrawled across it in loopy, deliberate handwriting. My stomach tightened, I recognized it instantly. It was my grandmother's. Grandma Eleanor had passed away 2 weeks earlier. She'd been my last surviving family member, a fiercely independent woman who'd lived her entire life in the creaky Victorian house that she and my late grandfather had bought in the 1950s. I hadn't seen her much in the years before her death, life had gotten in the way, but I'd always admired her stubborn resilience and the way she seemed to carry the weight of the world without complaint. With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges, and a smaller envelope containing a set of keys. The letter was short. My dearest Eva. I've left you the house. It's a gift, though you may find it a burdensome one. There are things I never told you, things that will make sense in time. All I ask is that you trust your instincts, keep your wits about you, and, above all, never ignore the whispers. With all my love, Grandma Eleanor. P.S. The study is locked for good reason. Do not enter. The hairs on my arms prickled. The letter felt as if it carried the weight of something unspoken, something heavy. I told myself it was just grief making me paranoid. After all, who writes something like that to their granddaughter? It's a house, not Pandora's box. Or so I thought. The house was just as I remembered it. Perched on a hill overlooking a dense stretch of forest, it loomed like a sentry over the town below. The Victorian architecture was grand but weary, its peeling paint and sagging shutters evidence of decades gone by without proper upkeep. Still, there was a charm to it, a sense of timelessness that made me feel as if I'd stepped into another era. I parked my car in the gravel driveway and sat there for a moment, staring up at the house. The windows seemed to watch me, their glass eyes glinting in the late afternoon sun. For a brief second, I thought I saw a curtain twitch on the second floor, but when I blinked, it was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. Grief does funny things to the mind. The front door groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The air inside was cool and heavy, carrying the faint scent of lavender and something else I couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and the floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The entryway was just as I remembered it from childhood visits. The grand staircase curved elegantly upward, its banister worn smooth from decades of use. To my left was the parlor, its furniture covered in white sheets like ghosts waiting to be unveiled. To my right, the dining room, where an ornate chandelier hung precariously, its crystals catching the light in fractured rainbows. I set my bags down and walked slowly through the house, memories flooding back with every step. The kitchen still had the same outdated appliances, and the wallpaper in the hallway was still the same faded floral pattern I'd stared at as a child. Yet, beneath the nostalgia, there was an undercurrent of unease, like the house was holding its breath. It wasn't until I reached the study door that the unease turned into something sharper. The door was just as my grandmother had described, locked. I tried the handle out of instinct, even though I knew it wouldn't budge. The wood felt unnaturally cold against my palm. For a moment, I thought about her warning, the study is locked for good reason. Do not enter. I felt a pang of defiance rise in me. What could possibly be so dangerous in there? But then I shook my head, chastising myself. There would be time to figure all of this out later. For now, I needed to settle in. As I made my way upstairs to the bedroom I'd claimed as my own during childhood visits, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house was silent, save for the groaning of the floorboards beneath my feet, but the silence felt watchful. As if the house itself was waiting for something. Or someone. I unpacked slowly, methodically, trying to shake the strange sense of unease that clung to me like a second skin. The bedroom I'd chosen was at the far end of the upstairs hallway, away from the study. It was small, but cozy, with a four-poster bed draped in faded lace curtains and a bay window that overlooked the sprawling backyard. As night fell, the house seemed to shift. The shadows in the corners grew deeper, the creaks in the floorboards louder. I told myself it was just the natural settling of an old house, but the explanation felt hollow. Even the air seemed heavier, as if the house was pressing down on me. I made myself a simple dinner, a sandwich and a cup of tea, and sat in the kitchen, the sound of the old grandfather clock ticking steadily in the background. Every so often, I thought I heard something, the faint sound of footsteps, the whisper of fabric brushing against a wall. Each time I would freeze, holding my breath, but the sounds would stop as suddenly as they started. It wasn't until I went to bed that the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind. The soft murmuring rose and fell, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. But as I lay there, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, I realized the whispers were too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was as if someone was speaking just beyond the edge of my comprehension. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, just as I was beginning to think I'd imagined it, I heard it again, a soft, almost mournful voice, calling my name. "Eva." I scrambled out of bed, grabbing the nearest object I could find, a heavy candlestick from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I crept to the door, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window at the far end. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My own words seemed to echo back at me, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I took a hesitant step forward, then another. The whispers had stopped, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. I could feel eyes on me, even though the hallway was empty. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn back, to lock the door and hide under the covers like a scared child. But I couldn't. Something was drawing me forward. When I reached the top of the staircase, I froze. The air was icy, and the shadows seemed to writhe, as if alive. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained my ears, waiting for the whispers to start again. Instead, there was a single sound, soft, deliberate footsteps, coming from the direction of the study. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the lock, and once it was secure, I backed away, my chest heaving. The whispers didn't return that night, but I didn't sleep a wink. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed, the candlestick clutched tightly in my hands, and waited for the dawn. Morning brought little relief. The sunlight streaming through the windows should have felt warm and reassuring, but instead, it seemed to cast harsh, unforgiving light on the house's worn interior. Every creak and groan of the old wood seemed louder in the stillness of the morning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had changed overnight. After a quick breakfast, I found myself standing in front of the study door once again. The unease I'd felt the night before was still there, but now it was tinged with something else, curiosity. What could be so dangerous behind this door that my grandmother had gone to such lengths to keep it locked? I tried the handle again, just to be sure. It was still locked, of course. The keys she'd left me didn't fit, and the door was solid, refusing to budge even when I pressed my shoulder against it. But as I stood there, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, faint scratches around the keyhole, as if someone had tried to pick the lock. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. Was it possible that someone else had been in the house? Or had my grandmother? I shook the thought away and decided to focus on other tasks. The house was old and full of secrets, I would deal with the study later. Still, as I dusted and cleaned, I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the door every time I passed it, as if expecting it to swing open on its own. By mid-afternoon, I'd made my way up to the attic. The air up there was thick and musty, and the sunlight filtering through the small, dirty window illuminated decades of dust and cobwebs. Boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly, their contents spilling out in some places. I began sorting through them, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed light on the strange events of the previous night. It didn't take long to find something unusual. In an old wooden chest, buried beneath yellowed linens, I found a bundle of papers tied together with twine. The top sheet was a letter, written in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Eva. If you're reading this, it means you've already noticed that the house is different. I'm sorry I couldn't explain more while I was alive, but some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. The house has always been more than just a home. It's alive, in a way, and it remembers. There is something in the study, something that should never be disturbed. Please, my dear, promise me you will leave it be. All my love, Grandma Eleanor. I stared at the letter, my mind racing. Alive? The house was alive? The idea was absurd, and yet. I couldn't deny the strange occurrences, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. My grandmother's words were a warning, but they felt more like a challenge. For the rest of the day, I avoided the study. But as night fell once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay behind that door was calling to me. The whispers started earlier that night. I had barely finished washing the dinner dishes when I heard them, faint and distant, as if they were coming from the far end of the house. My heart leapt into my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. If I was going to live here, I had to get used to the strange noises, or so I told myself. I followed the sound, my footsteps slow and deliberate on the creaking floorboards. The whispers grew louder as I approached the study. They were unintentionally rhythmic, like a forgotten song on the edge of memory, repeating and fading, only to return with more urgency. I pressed my ear to the study door, straining to make sense of the sound. It was almost a chant, a low murmur that vibrated deep in my chest. But no matter how hard I focused, the words refused to take shape. I was on the verge of retreating when something scraped against the other side of the door, a long, deliberate drag, like nails on wood. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and ran upstairs, to the attic. I didn't know why I went there, it wasn't a safe haven, but something about the house made me move as if it had a will of its own. The attic was stifling, the air thick with the scent of mildew and old wood. I rummaged through the boxes aimlessly, desperate for something, anything, to make sense of what was happening. That's when I found the key. It was buried in a small wooden box, hidden beneath a stack of faded photographs. The box itself was plain, but the key inside was ornate, its handle etched with intricate designs that seemed to twist and shift under the dim light. The metal was cold against my skin, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread as I held it. This was no ordinary key, it felt like it carried a weight far greater than its size. I stood there in the attic, staring at the key, my thoughts racing. Was this the key to the study? And if it was, should I use it? My grandmother's warning echoed in my mind, the study is locked for good reason. Do not enter. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were daring me to act. I clenched the key tightly in my hand and descended the attic stairs, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself I would only try the key, just to see if it fit. I wouldn't open the door, not yet. The hallway was eerily quiet as I approached the study. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, as if it belonged there. My hand froze on the knob, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But curiosity is a powerful thing. The door creaked open an inch, revealing only darkness beyond. I closed it quickly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't bring myself to look inside, not yet. I retreated to my room, the key burning in my pocket like a guilty secret. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed with the key on the nightstand, its metallic sheen catching the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. The house was quiet now, too quiet. The oppressive silence was almost worse than the whispers, and I found myself straining to hear even the faintest sound. When sleep finally came, it was restless and filled with vivid dreams. In the dream, I was standing in the hallway, just outside the study. The door was open, but instead of the cramped room I had glimpsed earlier, there was only darkness. The kind of darkness that swallowed everything it touched, thick and suffocating. I stepped closer, the air growing colder with each passing moment, until I was standing at the threshold. "Come in," a voice beckoned, soft but insistent. It was my grandmother's voice, or at least it sounded like hers. But there was something off about it, something hollow and unfamiliar. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorframe. "Eva," the voice called again, sharper this time. "You have to come in." Against my better judgment, I stepped through the doorway, and the world shifted around me. The walls disappeared, replaced by an endless expanse of black. The air felt heavy, thick with a damp chill that clung to my skin. A faint light glimmered in the distance, and I felt compelled to move toward it, even as dread coiled in the pit of my stomach. The light grew brighter, revealing a single chair in the middle of the void. It was old and ornate, its dark wood gleaming like wet ink. Someone was sitting in it, a figure cloaked in shadows, their face obscured. They didn't move, but I could feel their eyes on me, sharp and piercing. "Why did you come back?" the figure asked, their voice a blend of malice and sorrow. I tried to speak, to explain, but no words came out. The figure rose from the chair, their shadowy form stretching and twisting unnaturally as they loomed over me. "Eva," they said, their voice a low growl now. "You don't belong here." I woke with a start, my heart pounding and my skin damp with sweat. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been, and the key on the nightstand seemed to glint with an unnatural light. The dream had felt too real, as though it were more than just a product of my subconscious. I sat there in the dark, clutching the blanket around me, and tried to shake the lingering unease. But deep down, I knew the dream was a warning. Something in the study was waiting for me. The next morning, I woke feeling drained, as though the dream had stolen something vital from me. The key still sat on the nightstand, its intricate design catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever was in the study had called to me, and I knew I had to confront it. I spent the day preparing myself. I cleaned the kitchen, made a pot of strong coffee, and packed a flashlight, a notebook, and the candlestick from the night before. The absurdity of arming myself with an antique piece of brass wasn't lost on me, but it was better than nothing. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows, felt like a reminder of what was waiting for me. By the time dusk fell, my resolve was set. I stood outside the study door, the key in my hand. The hallway was unnervingly quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. My hand trembled as I slid the key into the lock. It turned with an audible click, and I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. But as I reached for the doorknob, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more distinct, like a chorus of voices, just on the edge of comprehension. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, warning, and something else I couldn't quite place. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, "The study is locked for good reason. Do not enter." But I couldn't stop now. The door swung open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, golden light. The air inside was thick and electric, making my skin prickle. The study looked nothing like I remembered from my childhood visits. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with ancient, leather-bound volumes, their spines embossed with unfamiliar symbols. A large desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, quills, and a strange, unlit oil lamp. But it was the mirror on the far wall that drew my attention. It was massive, its ornate frame carved with twisting, serpentine designs that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The glass wasn't reflective, instead, it shimmered like the surface of a still pond, faint ripples distorting the faint images within. I stepped into the room, the whispers growing louder as I approached the mirror. My reflection didn't greet me. Instead, I saw shadows swirling beneath the surface, and within them, faint faces began to take shape. They stared back at me with hollow, desperate eyes. "Eva," a voice called from the mirror. It was my grandmother's voice, but it wasn't coming from the shadows. It came from the mirror itself. "Grandma?" I whispered, my throat dry. Her face appeared in the glass, pale and shimmering, her expression filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't have opened the door." I froze in place, my breath catching as my grandmother's face stared back at me from the mirror. Her features were familiar, but there was something different about her. The sorrow in her eyes seemed deeper, heavier, as though she carried the weight of something I couldn't begin to comprehend. "Grandma?" I whispered again, my voice trembling. "Is it really you?" Her image flickered, the shimmering surface of the mirror distorting her face momentarily. "It's me, Eva," she said, her voice soft, but laced with urgency. "But you shouldn't be here." "I don't understand," I said, stepping closer. The air around the mirror was icy, and I could feel a strange energy pulsing from it. "You left me the house. You told me to trust my instincts. What's going on?" She looked away for a moment, her expression conflicted. "I had no choice," she said. "The house, it isn't just a home. It's a prison. And the mirror is its anchor." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "A prison for what?" I asked. "For memories. For lives," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The house feeds on them, Eva. It keeps them trapped here, repeating their pain and despair. I thought I could contain it, but it's grown too strong. That's why I locked the study, why I left you that warning." I stared at her, my mind racing. "Then why give the house to me?" I demanded, anger creeping into my voice. "Why not destroy it yourself?" Her image flickered again, her face twisting with regret. "I couldn't," she admitted. "I wasn't strong enough. But you are. That's why I left it to you." I shook my head, taking a step back. "No, I can't do this," I said. "This isn't what I signed up for. I just wanted to understand, too." "You must," she interrupted, her voice sharp now. "You have to destroy the mirror. It's the only way to break the house's hold. But be careful, Eva. It will fight back." As if on cue, the shadows in the room began to stir. They pulled on the floor, rising like smoke and coiling around me. The whispers grew louder, angrier, and the air became suffocating. My grandmother's image started to fade, her voice distant and strained. "Destroy it, Eva," she said, her face disappearing into the rippling surface. "Before it's too late." The shadow surged toward me, and I stumbled back, clutching the candlestick like a lifeline. The mirror's surface shimmered violently, and the faces within it pressed against the glass, their mouths open in silent screams. My heart pounded as the room seemed to close in around me. And then, with a deep, guttural groan, the house came alive. The house shuddered violently, the walls groaning like a living creature in pain. The shadows swirled around me, twisting into shapes that seemed almost human, their elongated limbs stretching toward the mirror. The air was thick, suffocating, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my grandmother's words echoed in my mind, "Destroy the mirror. It's the only way." "Eva," the voices hissed in unison, blending into a guttural growl that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "You belong to us." The mirror rippled, and the faces pressed harder against the glass, their mouths forming desperate, silent pleas. My grandmother's image flickered once more, her expression filled with a mix of urgency and sorrow. "Do it, Eva," she said, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "Don't let it take you." My grip tightened on the candlestick. The shadows coiled closer, their movements more aggressive, and I felt a sharp, icy pain as one of them brushed against my arm. I stumbled back, barely avoiding their grasp, and raised the candlestick high. But I hesitated. "What happens if I break it?" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Will the house, will you?" Her image blurred, her face contorting as if she were in pain. "You mustn't worry about me," she said. "The house must end, Eva. It can't take any more lives." I glanced at the mirror, my heart pounding. The shadows surged again, their tendrils reaching for my legs. With a cry of desperation, I swung the candlestick at the mirror. The metal struck the glass with a deafening crack, a jagged fracture spreading across its shimmering surface. The house screamed. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before, a deep, guttural roar that rattled the walls and made the floor beneath me tremble. The shadows recoiled, writhing in agony, and the mirror surface rippled violently, as if it were trying to repair itself. I struck it again, harder this time, and the crack deepened. The faces in the glass twisted and distorted, their silent screams growing more frantic. The shadows surged toward me, a wave of darkness that seemed intent on swallowing me whole. And then the mirror shattered. The mirror exploded with a deafening sound, shards of glass flying in every direction. I ducked instinctively, shielding my face as the fragments rained down like ice-cold needles. The house roared again, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from its very foundation. The shadows writhed in agony, their forms twisting and dissipating as if the shattered mirror had severed their connection to the house. The room began to tremble violently, the walls cracking and buckling. Books tumbled from the shelves, and the desk overturned with a resounding crash. The golden light that had filled the study faded, replaced by an oppressive darkness that seemed to pull everything toward the center of the room. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I watched the study collapse in on itself. The air grew colder, and I could feel an invisible force pressing against me, urging me to leave. But I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was paralyzed with fear. "Run!" My grandmother's voice echoed faintly, her tone sharp and urgent. "Eva, get out now." Her words jolted me into action. I turned and bolted out of the study, the floorboards splintering beneath my feet as I raced down the hallway. The house groaned and shuddered, the walls collapsing inward as if the entire structure were being devoured by an unseen force. By the time I reached the front door, the ceiling had begun to cave in. Chunks of plaster and wood rained down around me, and the air was thick with dust and the acrid scent of decay. I threw the door open and stumbled out onto the front lawn, collapsing to my knees as the house let out one final, ear-splitting roar. I turned just in time to see the house implode, the walls folding in on themselves until there was nothing left but a smoldering crater. The oppressive weight that had hung over me since I arrived was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The whispers had stopped. The shadows were gone. The house, and whatever dark force had inhabited it, was no more. I sat on the cold, damp grass, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The night was still, eerily quiet, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The house was gone, reduced to a blackened, smoldering crater in the ground. The weight that had pressed down on me since I'd first arrived was lifted, but in its place was a hollow ache. For a long time I didn't move. My body felt heavy, my mind a foggy mess of exhaustion and disbelief. I stared at the crater, half expecting the house to reappear, as though it had been some cruel trick of the mind. But it didn't. The shadows were gone. The whispers were silent. The house was truly, finally gone. I thought about my grandmother, her warnings, her sorrowful expression in the mirror, her final plea for me to end it all. I felt a pang of guilt that she had carried this burden alone for so long. But there was relief too. I'd done what she couldn't. I'd put an end to the house's dark grip on our family. "Thank you, Eva." Her voice was faint, like a breeze passing through the trees, but it was unmistakable. I glanced around, hoping to see her one last time, but there was nothing, only the crater and the darkened forest beyond. Still, her words lingered, wrapping around me like a warm embrace. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. The silence that followed was overwhelming. The house, with all its creaks and whispers, was gone, leaving behind an emptiness that felt both liberating and strange. For so long, it had felt like the house itself was alive, watching, listening, waiting. Now, all that remained was the hollow echo of its absence. I stayed by the crater until dawn, unable to bring myself to leave. The sky turned from deep black to a muted gray, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon. The soft light illuminated the remains of the house, or what little was left. Bits of scorched wood and twisted metal jutted out from the earth, but the oppressive energy that had once radiated from the place was gone. In the light of day, the hill seemed smaller, less imposing. The forest that had always felt so dark and foreboding now looked almost welcoming, its trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. The air was fresh and cool, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and grass. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt like I could breathe freely. I whispered a quiet goodbye, unsure if it was meant for my grandmother, the house, or the memories that I was leaving behind. Maybe it was for all three. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange sense of closure. I didn't know where I was going or what would come next, but I knew one thing for certain: I was free. Free from the house, free from its secrets, and free to move forward. Driving away from the hill, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the house standing there again, as if it had never been destroyed. But the hill was empty, the blackened crater barely visible from the winding road. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt, as though each mile put more distance between me and the weight I'd been carrying. Still, the memories lingered. The faces in the mirror, the whispers, my grandmother's voice, all of it felt so vivid, so real. I kept replaying her final words in my mind, trying to find comfort in them. "Thank you, Eva." They were words of gratitude, but they also carried a sense of finality, as if she, too, had found peace. I didn't have a destination in mind as I drove. The house had been the last tether to my past, and now that it was gone, I felt unmoored. But there was freedom in that, too, the freedom to start over, to carve out a life of my own. I stopped at a diner on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Over a plate of eggs and toast, I found myself jotting down notes in a small notebook I'd brought with me. The act of writing felt grounding, a way to process everything that had happened. The waitress, a kind woman with gray streaks in her hair, refilled my coffee cup and asked where I was headed. I smiled, shrugging lightly. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Just, somewhere new." She nodded, as if she understood. "Well, wherever you end up, I hope it brings you peace." Her words stayed with me as I left the diner and got back on the road. Peace. That was what I wanted now. Not answers, not closure, just peace. The road stretched out before me, endless and full of possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a future. And though the memories of the house and my grandmother would always be with me, I knew they no longer had the power to hold me back. The key was the turning point, the moment I realized there was no going back. That night, the whispers didn't just return, they engulfed the house. They came from every corner, echoing through the walls and ricocheting off the windows, surrounding me in a cacophony of pleading, anger, and sorrow. Each voice layered over the next until it became impossible to distinguish one from another. I stayed in my room, gripping the candlestick like a talisman. The air was cold and heavy, as though the house itself were breathing down my neck. The shadows under the door moved unnaturally, pooling together and then stretching out like grasping fingers. I knew they were waiting for me to falter, to give in to fear. The dreams came even before I fell asleep, flickering in the edges of my consciousness like a broken film reel. I saw the house as it had been decades ago, bustling with life. My grandmother appeared, younger and full of determination, her hands pressed against the mirror as if trying to hold something back. I could feel her fear, her desperation. The image shifted, and I saw myself standing in her place, the shadows closing in. The whispers grew louder, pulling me out of the dream and into the waking nightmare of the house. I stumbled out of bed, the key burning in my pocket like a brand. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. The house wouldn't let me. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow under the study door. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, drawing me toward it. The shadows writhed along the walls, their movements frantic, as if trying to stop me. But something deeper within me pushed forward, a mixture of defiance and sheer survival instinct. When I reached the study door, I hesitated. My grandmother's voice echoed in my mind, "You have to destroy the mirror. But beware, it will fight back." With trembling hands, I turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. The study was alive with energy, the air crackling like a storm about to break. The mirror dominated the room, its surface rippling violently, the faces within it pressing against the glass. They screamed soundlessly, their mouths wide with terror. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath my weight. The shadow surged toward me, coiling and twisting like snakes, but I kept my eyes on the mirror. I could feel its power, its malevolence. It was the source of everything, the whispers, the shadows, the house itself. Eva, my grandmother's voice, called, faint but steady. Her face appeared in the mirror, her expression resolute. It's time. The shadows lunged at me, and I raised the candlestick, swinging it with all my strength. The doorknob stilled, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I pressed myself against the cold wall. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on the other side was waiting for me to falter, to make one wrong move. But I was done hiding. My grandmother had entrusted me with this house, with its secrets, and I couldn't leave without knowing the truth. I grabbed the key to the study, my hand trembling but resolute. Every step down the darkened hallway felt like a mile. The shadows stretched unnaturally, writhing like they were alive, but I kept my focus on the study door. When I reached it, I hesitated, the memory of my grandmother's warning ringing in my ears. But then I thought of the whispers, the footsteps, the dreams. Ignoring them hadn't worked. Perhaps it was time to face them head-on. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, as if the door had been waiting for this moment. With a soft click, it swung open, revealing the study in all its otherworldly glory. The air inside was electric, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. The mirror on the far wall shimmered, its surface no longer reflective but rippling like water. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice that resonated from the mirror itself. Eva, it called, the voice layered with a dozen different tones, all speaking in unison. You were meant to come. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaking. The mirror rippled again, and for a moment, I saw my grandmother's face staring back at me, her expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. You must finish what I could not, she said. The house is alive, Eva, and it feeds on memories, on lives. I tried to contain it, but it has grown stronger. You must seal it, before it takes you too. Seal it? How? My voice was barely a whisper. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing closer. The mirror cracked, and through the fractures, I saw glimpses of the house's true form, a labyrinth of endless hallways, rooms stacked upon rooms, each one filled with echoes of people who had lived and died within its walls. I realized then that the house wasn't just alive, it was a parasite, feeding on those it ensnared. You must break its anchor, my grandmother's voice urged. Destroy the mirror. But beware, it will fight back. The room shuddered violently, and the shadows surged toward me. I grabbed the candlestick from my pocket and swung it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered, and a deafening roar erupted, the shadows writhing in agony as the house began to shake. The walls cracked, the ceiling buckled, and I could feel the house collapsing in on itself. I ran, the floorboards splintering beneath my feet. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices begging, pleading, cursing. When I finally burst through the front door and into the cold night air, the house let out one final, guttural groan before imploding. It collapsed inward, leaving nothing but a smoldering crater where it had once stood. I stood there, trembling and covered in dust, watching the remnants of my family's legacy disappear into the earth. The whispers were gone, and for the first time since I arrived, the air felt still. Free. As I turned to leave, I felt a presence beside me. My grandmother's voice, soft and full of love, whispered in my ear. Thank you, Eva. And then she was gone.